Okay, great. Okay, thanks everybody for coming to this open space session. And I'm very pleased to be launching today a report on research priorities for humanitarian shelter and settlements. And this was a piece of work which was commissioned by the Shelter Cluster, the strategic advisory group of the Shelter Cluster, and thanks to them for recognizing the issues of evidence and research and commissioning this piece of work. Thanks also to Shirin, who is sharing the slides. And Shirin, would you please move on to the next slide? Thanks. I think there's a lag between moving on to the next slide, but I hope we'll see the next slide soon. Thank you, that's it. And so what the Strategic Advisory Group of the Shelter Cluster wanted to do was to identify key research questions that the Global Shelter Cluster should respond to. And so what is going to be presented here is a list of priority key research themes and questions. And the idea is that these are going to be used. And so it would be great to have some conversations about that as we go along for this session today. And we've got half an hour for this session, so it will be great to be able to work on those. So next slide, please, Shirin. Thank you. And so the rationale for this is to take forward the Shelter Cluster strategy. And strategic area 3 is evidence-based response. And it's one of the things that is really important in the 4 areas. And to identify the evidence gaps and then to fill those evidence gaps, because the point about evidence is to be able to demonstrate that there are very strong reasons for doing certain types of shelter. There are very strong reasons for producing advocacy messages to donors, to humanitarian agencies and other stakeholders. And how we make those messages is based on evidence. So it's a much stronger message if we can say, here is a set of research evidence that we've investigated and we've analysed, and so that the messages that we want to take and make are supported very strongly by evidence. So next slide, please, Shirin. And so the methodology for this was to talk to the member agencies of the, that's it, thanks, of the Shelter Cluster. And so it boundaries of work, and it could be expanded to other agencies. But the thinking was that the Shelter Cluster agencies of the Strategic Advisory Group are some of the most important agencies in shelter response. And so a good place to start for the Shelter Cluster was to be able to identify with these agencies and with the representatives of the agencies what their priorities for research were, where they see the evidence gaps. They're the people that are working on shelter. They're the people that are very close to the issues in shelter. So to be able to dig into some of these issues with the people that are representing the agencies in order to get their identification of the research gaps and the research that needs to be done to generate the evidence. Very importantly, the SAG was also asked to agree how to prioritize the themes. And this was the subject of a debate to say, now that we've identified the themes, how do we prioritize them? Next slide, please. So the main finding is that there are 2 clear research priorities identified, which was to collect evidence for the wider impact of shelter and settlements programs, especially on health. And the second one was to understand how cash and markets programming influences shelter and settlements outcomes. And these were the 2 top things that were mentioned most often by the agencies. And in the report, you'll be able to see that there were a number of themes, and there were, I mean, in fact, there were, I'm just finding the themes, there were 45 themes that were identified in total. And so out of those themes, when we gathered them together, the wider impact was mentioned in the identified themes 6 times, and the cash and markets issues were mentioned 5 times, and the next ones were mentioned twice each. So next slide, please, Shirin. So after those 2 clear research priorities, the next most common research priorities were conflict, research into conflict, research into space standards, research into self-recovery, research into housing, land and property issues, and research into long-term impact and recovery. Next slide, please. And so just going into the one back, please, thank you. So just going into the wider impact a little bit as one of the main themes. Thanks, that's fine, Shirin. So what I did with each of the shelter cluster agencies was to ask them what themes were most important to them. And as you will see in the report, the identification of the theme is not just a question about what do you think is most important. It's why it's important, what the research proposals could be, and what the impact could be. Because this is the thing that drives research, which is to understand why you're doing it, what it's for, and what impact it could have. And when you identify a research question, those are the 3 most important things to be able to communicate. And for anybody who's going to use this research, it becomes the important to be able to understand why they might do it and what the impact should be in order for that research to remain relevant to practice, because that's one of the things that I think is really important as an outcome of this research, is that it should be relevant to the practice of shelter and settlements. And one of the things that with a conversation between operational shelter people and academics, it's really important to get right, is that understanding of what the research should be used for, so that it is a commonly held research goal between the 2 areas, and both are contributing to the clarity of why it's important and what it should be used for. And so the wider impact, so the importance of the wider impact is to demonstrate how these wider impacts can have a serious effect on mortality and morbidity, which is the fundamental rationale for humanitarian intervention. And so, for example, in health, to be able to demonstrate, to be able to provide evidence that shelter interventions, that housing has an effect on health, which can then have an effect on prevention of disease or resistance to disease, which promotes that humanitarian goal. So with the wider impact, the proposals were to map factors in household well-being and develop a theory of change about underlying factors, and then devise indicators which can be used in shelter agencies' monitoring and evaluation programs. And the impact of this would be that, well, it would be that they are that significant numbers of families, that these issues affect significant numbers of families which are housing related, and also importantly is that humanitarian funding for shelter and settlements would be further justified, as that we could demonstrate better value for money. And I'm sure you've heard some of the comments in the shelter meetings about the fact that the shelter sector, the shelter response following a crisis is not very well funded. And the idea is that better evidence would enable the justification of more funding and to better reach the funding goals for a shelter response. Next slide, please. And so then cash and markets. So the agencies identified cash and markets research as being very important because of the issue between unconditional, for example, one of the issues, unconditional cash programs and a lack of understanding about how that feeds through to shelter and settlements outcomes. And then also the issue about technical assistance for shelter, justifying technical assistance as part of cash programs or unconditional cash programs or market assistance programs. And you can see there about the research proposals, increasing the chances of achieving good shelter outcomes in multi-purpose cash. How can markets support shelter self-recovery? So these are quite specific questions, and in the report there are some specific questions that come out which are able to be taken as research questions and taken forward by researchers or research organisations. So is shelter a safety net in a landscape of cash and market support? And then a comparative study of cash for shelter versus direct build, and then the hypothesis that technical support is needed in cash to ensure good shelter outcomes, and then the impact of that, again, evidence to guide informed decisions, more effective shelter programming, and then a reliable shelter technical quality. And so my final slide, next slide please, Shirin. And what I would like to engage in a discussion about is further work on to advance the global shelter cluster strategy on evidence. So what do we need to increase the work within the partners of the shelter cluster on pillar 3? And the report suggests to create a network of research partners, to map out research capacity, to put together advocacy messages to research funders, to encourage funding in this area, to continue this research, the research on identification of the questions by involving a wider group of shelter stakeholders, not just the SAG, to explore these themes, to support existing research collaborations, and then to develop tools to assist in data gathering in shelter responses and how that data can be turned into evidence and knowledge. There is some movements on this already, and many of you might know about the Interaction Academic Practitioner Network that's being set up, so that's an important item in this area. And there have been some other pieces of further work in this area. Aaron Opdyke identified some research priorities, and the Ian Davis work from 45 or so years ago, and then more recently in the book Shelter After Disaster also identified some research priorities. So there's a literature review at the end of the report which compares these findings against other identifications of research priorities. And just one final thing which I didn't mention, the prioritization of the research goals. In the discussion with the SAG, there were a number of different elements of prioritization that were proposed. Some need, some, but the prioritization that the SAG ended up with and ended up agreeing on was that it should be this research should be prioritized in alignment with the global shelter cluster strategy, and it was notable that the numbers that I identified for the most commonly mentioned research themes were in alignment with the global shelter cluster strategy, which identifies wider impacts of shelter and cash and markets. Okay, so that's my presentation over. So I will be very happy to answer any questions, to receive any comments, and to receive ideas about any things that this meeting thinks would be useful to take forward as next steps. So please do put some things in the chat, or if you want to raise a hand, please do that and I will come to you. I have circulated the report to the people that registered for the session, and please do, and Miguel has put in the registration document, so if you haven't registered for the session, please do that and I will circulate the report to you. It will be posted on the Global Shelter website, Global Shelter Cluster website in the near future, and it will be hosted there. Brilliant. And Shirin has put a link to the report. Thanks, Shirin. That's really useful. Okay. So I see that there are researchers here in the meeting. There are some shelter operational people representing organisations. There is a question about how useful this is going to be. Is this going to be useful for the research organisations to take forward to be able to bid for research? Is this a useful document to be able to say, here are the needs that we have identified, and does this justify future funding? So that's a question. That's a potential question. And then also for shelter organisations. Okay, so Bill is saying, apart from health, what are the other wider impacts? Okay, that's a very good point. And so, and bear with me 1 second.
Charles, this is Andy Powell here. I can't use the chat function, as apparently it's disabled, but
okay, Andy, yes.
One question I might pose, or if we think is important, is limitations on pursuing research funding to date. You know, I think there's limitations of data maybe, or limitations of recognition, the kind of ideas around housing and shelter, but maybe as a question, I don't know what we all feel are the limitations in us pursuing sources of funds for research.
What do you mean? Say more, Andy, but what do you mean about the limitations?
If we were to put our heads together right now, how many opportunities for research funding in this area, in this space, do we know about?
Right. Okay, that's a really good point. Thank you. Yeah. So there are academic sources of funding for research, all kinds of academic research, but there is one particular fund called the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is run by the UK research organisation, and that is, I mean, it's coming to the end of its lifetime now, but it was 1.2 billion over 5 years, and that was specifically for research into development issues, humanitarian issues, and research in less developed countries. And that was, so that's a set of funds that are not normally something that humanitarian organisations and humanitarian responders would see, but they are funds that and so we've had some success, and certainly with CARE in bidding into these funds and making alliances between research organisations, or universities in this case, and INGOs to be able to demonstrate those linkages. And the funders are very keen to see that linkage. They're also keen to see a linkage with academics in less developed countries, and to be able to demonstrate that partnership is there, that the research is able to be done and is relevant to the countries in question. So we've had success. So now three research funds that we've bid into, and the latest one is some £750,000, which is the self-recovery research that we're doing at the moment. So they're quite significant sums of money, and the partnerships are, and it's able to work on existing programs and develop those programs into places where we can gather data and build knowledge from and have lessons learned, in order that they can be then turned, the kind of results of the program can be turned into research, and we can ask questions of ongoing programs to make sure that they are then turned into good evidence. So significant sums of money there. Also, the EU ECHO funds there are research funds within EU ECHO, and other countries also have. I mean, it's a big industry, academic research funding. And if we can make the linkages between academics and operational agencies, I think they're a great. There's a very good story to tell about how that the reach and the impact of operational agencies enables much better research to be done in partnership than universities and academics can do on their own. So there, in answer, I mean, I'm not sure if that answers your question completely, but there are sources of funding that academics or through academics can access, and there is a need for advocacy in these areas so that the funders themselves know that there is an appetite for spending the funds and or an appetite for using funds to address humanitarian issues, and then most importantly the impact that can make, because academic funders are very keen on impact at the moment. Something that NGOs have known for a long time, and it's one of the things that NGOs are very good at, but academics are now very keen to demonstrate the impact of research, and we are, and certainly the self-recovery collaboration have been very good at demonstrating that, and we hope to be able to do that in future. Bill's question was, okay, Bill, again, thank you, might increase the opportunities for funding to current humanitarian concerns. I think that's a really good point, to be able to take these issues and discuss them in the wider humanitarian conversations. And so I think that's a very good point. So any more, are there any more issues? Do speak up or put your hand up if you would like to make a comment. Hang on, Bill. I'm aware that Bill's question about the wider impacts was there. I'm just scrolling through the report now just to make sure that I'm gathering information about wider impacts, and I'm just finding the bit of it where it says it. Okay, so shelter and health, shelter and livelihoods, shelter and protection, environment. So those are the things that are mentioned in the issues about wider impact: livelihoods, protection, environment, and a general issue about household well-being. So that's good. So I'm taking away from the meeting that there is a really good opportunity to be able to raise some of these issues in wider humanitarian discussions. So I think that's a good opportunity to do something in that direction. So anything, what do people think about the point about these issues should be discussed? Okay, there's a hand. Philippe. Yes, Philippe, please do speak up.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Philippe Garnier from Crater School of Architecture of Grenoble. I have time to go through your work, and thanks for your report. I was just wondering if there was a kind of change in the I mean, we are not the first to question ourselves about the relation between research and the humanitarian world. and I would like to know if you have any idea about what has been in the past the priorities compared to the current priorities and so on, and maybe what has been already research in the past to see how it can the current situation. Personally speaking, I'm always also wondering about the between bracket the efficiency of aid. I mean, where to take the decisions where you have money from the big international aids, where there is a huge disaster like Haiti or many other places. How at the end the decision taken by putting money in this or that program would impact the long-term situation of the country. This is just personal things. Yeah. Sorry if I was too long.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Philippe. That's a really good point. Long-term impact has been identified as a particular issue, and I think that's a really great question about what that long-term impact is. It was identified as a research priority. It's something that there is a group of us that have been talking about in linking to how humanitarian response programs link to development processes and organizations. And there is a session, funnily enough, today at 4 o'clock Geneva time, where we will be discussing that in more detail. But that certainly for me is a big gap, which really would be really useful to be filled, about going back to places to understand what the long-term impacts have been and trying to understand what allocations of either shelter assistance or funding had a particular impact. And there is a potential move from the publication and the group of Behind Shelter projects, the case studies for shelter, to be able to work on this and to be able to potentially, thank you, Shirin, at 16:30 today, to be able to work at going back and finding out who would be able to gather such information. And to your other questions, what research priorities have there been in the past? Really, there is the same research priorities come up again over the years, and what is needed, what the gap is to be able to turn those into evidence. And that's why the shelter cluster, it has a priority in the shelter cluster 2018 to 22 strategy to be able to generate more evidence, because those research areas haven't been really turned into evidence. And as for the research gaps, we are becoming more certain about the research gaps now that more people are engaging in looking for the research gaps. And there is an upcoming publication from the Interaction Academic Practitioner grouping called Roadmap for Research, where we should be much more clear about the gaps that are coming, because those chapters and that publication is well in production now. So we should have some more clarity very soon on that. Thanks, Philippe. Okay, it's now 10:30 Geneva time, and so thanks everybody for attending this launch, and I am now calling the meeting to a close. Again, do please sign up to the session, and I'll send you a copy of the report, but Shirin has also put a link to the report in the chat. Right, thank you very much. Thank you to Shirin for sharing the screen, and thank you to everybody, and please do